Hi, I'm Britt.
And my name is Alissa.
And this is SkeleTales.
And this is the podcast where we strive to answer the old question of, is my dead grandma watching me?
That is so true. We also share true tales of the strange, unusual, and paranormal.
Heck yeah, we do. What do we got in store this week, Britt?
Today we're talking about something truly strange and unusual called Acquired Savant Syndrome, or as I like to call it, getting ass ASS. Did you?
I did not put that.
I was trying to abbreviate it when I was writing out, and I was like, oh yeah, hell yeah, ass.
Yeah, I was going to say hashtag goals, getting me some acquired savant syndrome.
Yeah, so it's pretty rare. I think currently in the world right now, there are between like 33 and 37 documented cases of people with this syndrome.
For anyone who doesn't know what savant is, did you have a definition?
Well, I do. So okay. I was going to read a little snippet from sort of the expert doctor who is a psychiatrist, research director called Daryl Treffert. Yes, I have that correct. And he has specialized in savant syndrome of all sorts. And I think he's the one that actually coined the term. Oh, so I'm going to read just like a little snippet of I believe it was like from a medical journal that he wrote. A 56-year-old builder who had no particular prior interest or skills in art abruptly, for the first time in his life, becomes a poet, a painter, and a sculptor following a stroke that he miraculously survived. An 8-year-old boy begins calendar calculating after a series of seizures. These are examples of what I call the acquired savant, or what might also be called accidental genius. I actually like the second term better. Accidental
genius. I think in pop culture, probably the most prolific depiction of it is Rain Man, right? But that's like the autism savant. And then also Temple Grandin, the gal who revolutionized like the livestock industry and, you know, making cows feel safer before they're murdered. But this is a different thing, right?
He says before 1996, most of the savants I had met, except for Alonzo Clemens, were persons who were born with autism or some other developmental disability, and whom some marvelous talent exploded on the scene during infancy or childhood, mostly around the age of 3 or 4. And those cases are called congenital savant syndrome. So you're born with it, basically. Acquired savant syndrome, in contrast, are instances in which dormant savant skills emerge after a brain injury or disease in a neurotypical person, where few skills were evident before the injury. So his big question, and I think what really drove a lot of his research, is it possible for such dormant potential to reside in all of us? Like, do we all have this? And the challenge then is to figure out how to tap into these hidden abilities without having major cranial catastrophe.
Yeah.
What kind of drove me to this article to begin with is I was curious, like, is this like a new phenomenon, or has this been going on since the beginning of man? And he found that the first known case where it had sort of been documented was in 1923. It was a case in which a musical genius appeared in a 3-year-old child following having meningitis. And then again, it was documented in 1967, a case called Mr. Z, who demonstrated savant skills at the age of 9 after getting shot in the head. And he had some motor paralysis, but also the brain trauma emerged like new special abilities, savant skills. And then in 1991, an 8-year-old boy began to show exceptional calendar calculating after he had a hemispherectomy. So I guess like he had brain surgery. And then after that, he had this insane calendar calculating ability.
So that's like, what day of the week was October 9th, 1972? And he's like, Monday or whatever, right? That's
Yes. And like in a flash. Not like even, not like having to calculate in their head, like immediately knowing.
If the theory is that we all have this possibility, how the fuck would we know that? Like, is it math? Is it like quickly calculating because today's a Monday? It's not even Monday. I failed already.
Not a sponsor, sorry.
It's Friday. Shit. Yeah, and then you're like, today's Friday. I don't know any of this. This is like,
what is the month?
This should not be so hard. Okay, obviously. And then these people are doing it in a fraction of a second. Like, that's wild. Like, are we all born with this like encyclopedia of knowledge that we all have? And we're not aware that we have this. We can tap into like all the knowledge in the universe is really in our brain, but we can't
all
access
just blocked. It's yes.
Oh,
yes.
so
I know. That's
maddening.
what's so fascinating about this topic is it's like, is it in us all, or is it just this very tiny select few that can only tap into it because they have brain damage?
Yeah. Well, not even brain damage too, but like the autism variant of it as well.
True.
Right?
True.
Like,
yeah.
back in history, they think that people with autism are responsible for some huge leaps like in evolution because their brains were just so brilliant and could figure stuff out. Just no one else could. It just took like this exceptional brain that just changed history.
This is so terrible. So terrible. So the first known case that I was researching was found in the early 1700s. And back then, it was very un-PC, but savants were there, and they actually called them idiot savants, which is not PC now.
No, but that was used until quite recently. Like when the movie Rain Man came out, that was the terminology even then, in the 80s, I believe. So
we've come a long way, people. But we are talking today about the acquired savant syndrome. So did you find any fun stories out there?
I did find a story. Back in the day, I don't know if you're aware that it used to be a very huge point of contention, this discussion, whether when horses galloped, if they lifted all 4 of their feet off the ground at some point, or if they always had 1 foot on the ground. People were bored. There weren't cell phones. This is what they fought about. Okay. So back in 1878, Leland Stanford, who owned the land that would eventually become Stanford University, he had a racetrack there. And he's like, I am going to settle this once and for all. And he got in touch with this fella named Eadweard Muybridge. Took the pictures. You've probably seen these photos. If you see them, you will probably recognize them. It's a series of photos of a horse running, and you can see in mid-stride, there is a horse without his feet touching the ground. And finally, the whole thing was like settled once and for all. But that photographer actually wasn't always a photographer. He, up until 1860, was just an English fellow who came over to San Francisco, opened a bookstore, and lived a very quiet life for 30 years. In 1860, though, he decided he was going to go back to England to go find some rare books to bring back to his bookshop in San Francisco. He accidentally missed his boat from San Francisco to England, I guess, because they would go down around. We've talked about this. I don't know how the fuck it got from San Francisco to England, but it did somehow, the boat. So Edward misses his boat and is like, shit, I am not going to wait whatever months for the next boat. I'm going to try to do the first leg of this overland and go try to catch a boat in St. Louis. Gets in a stagecoach to take him from San Francisco to St. Louis. Somewhere in North Texas, though, going down a big hill, the stagecoach careens out of control into a tree. No seatbelts, obviously. It's way back in the day. One person is killed instantly. Edward is thrown from the carriage and lands headfirst onto a boulder, and it cracks his head open.
Oh, jeez.
So he is in a coma for 9 days. He ends up getting transferred to Arkansas. And for the next 3 months, he suffers from seizures and agonizing headaches. His hair turned white, stark white. He had double vision and temporarily lost all sense of hearing, taste, and smell. His friends also noticed a personality shift. He used to be like a patient bookworm, and now he was like real erratic and short-tempered and, would just fly off the handle at the smallest thing. He recovered a bit in the US. Then he finally gets over to England. He stays there for 5 years recovering. Now, when he was back in San Francisco, he'd been exposed to photography because it was like a new technology. But all of a sudden, when he was in England, he really started getting like fascinated by it. And eventually he just becomes one of the best photographers around. People want him for everything. He becomes very famous for his photography and art skills. He goes and shoots houses and stuff, which is how he hooks up with this Leland Sanford. Leland ends up paying him like $1 million eventually to like prove this horse thing, because he made a bet with somebody to prove it. So that's how that happened. On the day that he showed up to Stanford's house, everyone was looking at him. One, because he was this famous photographer, but two, because he had just been on trial for murder. So
this story just keeps deeper and deeper.
I know. So like basically now neurologists are looking back and being like, oh, this guy had this sudden savant syndrome. Like he had no interest, and all of a sudden he became super obsessed with photography, and then he'd innovate and innovate and innovate. And so with the funding from Stanford, he was able to create this 2-shutter system where you could take pictures and a new photography gel to like capture the images at such a rate that you could actually see the horses. Because before you would just have to open the exposure and then like cap it. He automated it. So like real huge advances thanks to this guy and thanks to his head injury. But yes, like many of these acquired savant cases, it came with a trade-off. So Muybridge met this woman named Flora, who was 21 years younger than him and a technician in his photography studio. At first, they were in love. They had a great relationship. But eventually, Eadweard traveled a whole bunch. Flora was bored. Like, she's like, what the fuck? So Eadweard's like, oh, I'm going to employ this fellow to take you to the movies and take you here and here. And obviously, her and this fellow end up hooking up. In 1874, Eadweard and his wife have a baby that they name Florido, possibly a mashup of Flora and Eadweard, probably Floretto, I mean, possibly. But right before Halloween in 1874, Eadweard came across a letter that Flora had written to this fella named Harry, the one that he had hired. And on it, she had written Little Harry on the baby's picture she had mailed to him. And so freaking, Eadweard's like, fuck this shit. And he gets pissed, grabs a gun, heads on over to Harry Larkin's house. He knocks on his door. And when Larkins answers, Eadweard says, this is a message from my wife, and shoots him through the heart. And he's dead before he hits the ground. So Eadweard gets arrested. Obviously, he gets put on trial for the murder of his wife's lover. There's a 12-person, all-male jury. They go, they deliberate, and come back and are like, yeah, we would have done the same thing. You're free to go. Innocent. Even though he like blatantly did it.
Oh my God.
Lost his shit, right? Okay, so 1870s.
Cold blood.
Wow. They agreed that they would have done the same thing. Flora and him get divorced. She ends up dying of typhoid anyway. And then he puts little baby Harry, Florida, in an orphanage and is like, see ya.
Oh, that's
pretty
so
cold-hearted.
Sad.
Yeah.
Oh, ooh, somebody's got to have done that 23andMe, right? To find out that their dad wasn't really Eadweard's. It was Harry's, like, right? It had to be.
I'm imagining it had to have been Harry's, but who knows? Who knows, right? So also, like, Eadweard, over the course, like, he used to be a very like well groomed, tidy fella, and then like by this time he's got like long hair, long beard, very bohemian, like kind of madman style.
Eccentric. Yeah.
So on that day where the horse pictures were taken, freaking Stanford's stoked. He throws his arms up. He's like, yes, I won this bet. Yes, yes. And it's all thanks to me. I did this. World, thank me, Stanford, for this. Eadweard was a little peeved by that. He was annoyed. He never got any credit, even though he was like an established murderer photographer now. Like everyone knew who he was. He wasn't getting that credit. But what he did with the technology that was developed was that he kept tinkering and kept tinkering. And then he was able to actually realize, oh, when I do this and I move these pictures that I've taken all in a row real fast, they move and they're animated. And so that's pretty much how movies came to be, was because this dude got in a carriage accident, busted his head open, and became obsessed with photography. And now we have movies today because of it.
That is incredible. Wow.
Yeah. And then he died in 1904. His last great project involved building a replica of the Great Lakes in his backyard. No one knew why. It was just him being him. So
obsessive.
Yeah, I guess.
Great story, Alissa. I'd never heard that before. That's phenomenal.
Yeah, just right there, you can see one of the leaps that happen because of someone's exceptional brain, right?
Yes.
Like, and that one was by accident, but like, that's crazy. That's why I wonder if anyone else would have been able to stumble upon it. Like, would we still be without movies if this guy had made his trip?
We would not be on this Zoom call.
We wouldn't even be on this Zoom call.
Oh, it's so wild.
Crazy.
Ooh.
So that's a story of Eadweard Muybridge. He added a bunch of vowels to his name. I think his name was just Eadweard, like Muybridge. And then he broke his head open. And then he's like, I need more vowels in my name. And I think he changed the spelling of his name. So I don't remember what it was and what it turned to, but that's pretty much it. Do you have any stories?
I do. I have one, much more recent story. I listened to a interview with a fella called Jason Padgett. Do you know this story?
This is the book I read.
Oh, it is.
He wrote a whole book.
Then you'll probably correct me then.
I don't know if I'll correct you. It's been a while.
So in 2002, Jason Padgett was this badass from Tacoma, Washington. That's only, like an hour from where you live? It's an hour and a half, maybe? Yeah, not far from where you are. He lifted weights. He partied. He was a bit of a ladies' man. One night, he decides to go to a karaoke bar. He has a drink. He sings a song, and he leaves the bar. On his way out, he is hit from behind right in the back of the head, and it knocks him down to the ground, and he is mugged. These two men begin kicking him in the head, kicking him in the back, and just beat the shit out of him, basically. So that night he goes to the hospital. They say he has a bruised kidney and a concussion, and then he was sent home. And the next morning, he said that everything just felt different. And he noticed that it started when he went to go wash his hands. He turns on the faucet, he washes his hands, he turns off the faucet, he dries his hands and realizes, oh, I'm drying my hands on a dirty towel. So he turns on the faucet, he washes his hands, he turns off the faucet, he uses a clean towel, and then he realizes, oh, the faucet handle is dirty. So this goes on. He says he washes his hands probably 20 times. In addition to this, sinks in this depression, and he finds himself wanting to sleep for hours and days on end. And he only leaves his house at night. He ends up nailing sheets and towels up on his windows so that no sunlight gets in. And after about, a few weeks, he begins noticing something different. As he's watching the water go down the drain, he's noticing these geometric shapes that are kind of within the water, and how there's all this pattern and everything. It's in the clock, it's in the doorknobs. He's noticing this pattern of geometric shapes everywhere. And eventually he went outside and saw this in the sun and in the trees and grass and flowers. And he realized at that moment that he hadn't seen the sun in 3 months. And he was seeing these shapes and realized that his brain was just basically being overstimulated by everything. He realizes that these shapes were also like a mathematical equation, but he didn't know math very well. Like, he didn't really understand it. He was like kind of slid by with school. He was not an academic. He was more about beefing up muscles or whatever. But he realized that these shapes were all related to pi. And so he begins by drawing these shapes that he was seeing.
Pi as in 3.14159 or whatever. Not
blueberry.
Pie.
Yeah,
okay,
not apple pie. The math. Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'll post a picture of his drawings, but basically there are these incredibly thin-lined, delicate geometric shapes and patterns that they almost look like mandala in the form of them. And they're really beautiful. But to him, it was all this mathematical equation that was brought to a physical form. He ends up getting his brain scanned by some scientists who want to study basically the fact that he has acquired savant syndrome. And they find that he indeed got brain damage from the mugging, and that his brain had rewired itself to compensate for the damage in this new way, which had exposed, I guess, his brain to this new way of thinking, because everything was visual to him now. Like, the whole world was this shape, all of these shapes. That's how he sees the world. Jason ends up going back to school and he takes a math class, and it was like the puzzle pieces all fit in. He was able to fit these equations with these drawings that he was doing, and he felt justified, and it was like where he was meant to be. And he also said what happened by going back to school is it got him into the world. He ends up meeting his wife at college, and they're happily married. What I found funniest about this story was that here he has this acquired savant syndrome. He's able to see numbers and pictures and art and geometric shapes. And as of when I watched this video, he was running a futon store in Tacoma, Washington.
Oh yeah, he was. I think that's right. I forgot about that. I think he might have run it beforehand too.
Oh, maybe. Everyone loves futons, he says.
Maybe we could go interview him. I could go in disguise and pretend I'm in the market for a futon. And then
bring your microphone. That's right. You're so close. We could.
What is the diameter of this futon leg? What, how can I slide math into pi into it? Something and really get him going.
What's interesting about most of these cases is that the savant abilities that these people acquire are almost all either art or math related, having to do with numbers or some kind of art, whether it's painting, sculpture, poetry.
So many pianos. They're playing music they're hearing in their head, and they can't stop playing this music. It's almost I guess what I was seeing, some researchers don't really believe in this acquired savant, in that it's not the congenital savant. It's not the same. Mm-hmm. They think that this is much more of it's OCD. Yeah, yes, it's like there's even doubt if talent is really a thing. Is there really God-given talent, or people just practice? And when you practice enough, you're going to get good at something. So the interesting thing I saw was that there's many cases of people with dementia and Alzheimer's that also develop these artistic talents later in life, which I'd never heard of, but they think it's a similar thing because it's damaging a similar part of the brain and it's unlocking this creative well inside them, which is really fascinating, man. That's super fascinating.
It is so fascinating. I will say there's not been one of these cases that I've found where there isn't a drawback. So yes, you have this artistic ability, or this, you can now, paint or do music, but almost all of them have some sort of depression or OCD or headache ailment that
like seizures,
that lingers.
No, it's true. There definitely seems to be a trade-off. So I know we are trying to get into the acquired savant, but I couldn't help. There was a little crossover into the congenital savant cases. And there's one fella who can look at a city once, like a cityscape once, and then draw that shit out precisely from memory.
I've seen his artwork.
Like, it's so good.
Immaculate.
Some of the acquired savant cases, they become obsessed, but they're, like you said, maybe you still work in a futon. Like, they're obsessed. They can do it. They have this skill and talent that they didn't know they had before, but I wouldn't necessarily, not all of them are like super high level. This fella, how his brain just remembers it, like streets, buildings, details on buildings.
It's incredible.
It is. It's so freaking cool. Were you saying that you had a couple that were not acquired, but
I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with savants and found something called the Sudden Savant, which is different than acquired savant because it does not involve brain trauma. I have a couple of short little stories. Okay. So this comes from a medical journal, the Wisconsin Medical Journal, and it's by our good friend Daryl Treffert again. There is a woman, we'll call her MF, 43-year-old woman, woke up one night in December 2016 with what she called, I quote, the urgent need to draw a multitude of triangles, multiple geometric and triangular formations, which quickly evolved to a web of complex, abstract designs. She recalled that she'd stayed up into the morning with a compulsive need to draw, which continued over the next 3 days at an intense level. She had no prior interest in training in art. By the third day, she was working on a piece that she named The Mayan, which took her 2 weeks to complete. And I'll post these pictures up in the show notes too, so you can see them. 3 months later, she had created 15 pieces with styles reminiscent of artists including Frida Kahlo and Picasso. She currently spends about 8 hours a day on her artwork, in addition to working as a real estate agent. Incorporated into most of her pieces is a mandalic style of which she was totally unaware prior to her art ability. She said, "My art style is an ever-growing, perpetual vision which leads me to create mandalic-style art, sacred geometry, and mysterious creature beings, all incorporated into art. Ideas are never-ending. It just flows so easily in my mind and onto paper." And I'll also post a picture of the self-portrait that she created of herself. So literally wakes up in the middle of the night with this like sudden urge to create art and has continued.
Does she have a brain tumor she doesn't know about? Like, that makes me like wary,
Has
like,
she
because
been
all of these
scanned?
involve
Yes.
some sort of brain injury. So then it makes me think, or like dementia, right? Like
maybe she has it, doesn't realize.
Exactly. Like, until now, I had no idea that this could also be found in dementia and Alzheimer's. So if this sort of stuff starts showing up, I think if I didn't have that knowledge, I'd be like, oh, this is fucking awesome. Look at me. I'm a sudden genius. But oh shit, no, there might be something else.
Something's real wrong with your brain.
At work up there.
So this next story is incredibly fascinating. And I touched on this. I think maybe you'd heard about something similar before. So MH was a 31-year-old journalist stationed in West Germany from 1983 to 1985. While there, he attended some basic German language classes and picked up a rudimentary ability to speak German. Things like please and thank you, how much, where's the train station? When he tried to speak German, he said most people would ask him to use English since they also spoke both languages. So one evening, he meets a middle-aged man in a bistro. MH tried speaking some German, such as like, hello, my name is, and saying that he was in the army and that he loved Germany. This acquaintance replied in German, but MH said, oh, I don't really understand. At that point, MH told the other man that he'd been in Germany for 25 months. And the man replied, oh, I should use a German accent. If you, no, that's French. What's a German accent? Help me.
if you have been in Germany for 24 months,
then
nope,
you can.
That's
French again. Oh my God. Sprechen, if you have been in 25 months, you can speak as the German. At that point, MH said that he had said that in an irrefutable declarative sentence. And much to my amazement, I discovered that he was right. Suddenly, for the first time ever, I understood everything he said in German, and I effortlessly replied in fluent German. For the next 15 to 20 minutes, we had a nonstop conversation. I understood and spoke German perfectly, but that ability was very short-lived. Then came the moment when I became aware of the strangeness of the phenomenon, and I tried to analyze the whats and the whys of the things happening. And as soon as my thoughts changed from subjective to objective, poof, my newly found ability vanished and has not returned. Then, at the age of 38, so he's now since left Germany, he was a civilian doing some outreach work for the Mormon church. My guess is he was on a Mormon mission. He visited a family one afternoon, and there was a piano there in their house. And he played a little. He says, very little growing up. He said he would just dink around on it and only knew maybe a couple of chords. So the mother of the family that he was visiting asked if he played the piano, and he replied, no, not really. But then, suddenly, my mind opened up as it had in Germany, and I began playing elaborately and spontaneously the notes and chords, this beautiful music, whatever it was, that I'd never heard before. But it was beautiful and flawlessly performed. Not once did I hit an off or sour note. My sudden and inexplicable musical ability lasted about 15 to 20 minutes. Then, just as with the German transient language ability, the musical ability vanished. When he realized what he was doing and tried to analyze the what and why of things, that musical genius disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared and was gone entirely forever. MH says, my memory of playing the piano like a virtuoso is still quite clear and certain. MH's experience is similar to that of, and here's the term you were looking for, foreign accent syndrome, which is described in sort of the islands of the genius. So foreign accent syndrome is rare and dramatic condition in which a person following a head injury will wake up with a foreign accent or even an entire language of a country that they have never even visited. So the most big case for this is of this Czech race car driver who was knocked unconscious in a speedway accident. When he regained consciousness, although he knew only the most basic English phrases, and he woke up fluently speaking English with the paramedics who were attending to him. After a full recovery, however, the fluency ended up disappearing, and it was very difficult to make himself speak or understand English, and he reverted eventually back to his native language, sort of after his brain had healed. In most persons with this foreign language syndrome, however, the change in language or this accent ends up remaining for the rest of their life.
That's so weird, man. We could use that on the podcast. You could use a good
little help
smack in the head. Have you tried that? Get
German
into that
accent.
German accent.
I'm so bad. Yeah. I think if I was going to get brain damage and come up with some kind of syndrome, I would want it to be a one with talent, not necessarily with a flawless German accent.
Some of these, though, this guy picturing, like, playing, like, I feel like maybe in their head, they're like, oh, I'm the amazing singer. But when you're actually listening, it's like, clonk, 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 like the word, like, it just is, like, terrible.
Somebody goes into the cafe and he thinks he's speaking this fluent, flawless German and real, And the guy sitting next to him, sure.
Well, it reminds me of a dream. Is actually like when you said that, I feel like I've had dreams like that. Like, oh my God, I can speak perfect French. Look at this. But something interesting, actually, the same thing with like the dementia sort of thing. When they look at these brains, and if this guy was a soldier, then he may have had like shell shock or some sort of head injury, right?
Yeah.
Because of his combat. But that they see that the creativity center, like it gets turned on and off. It literally, they can see it light up and then they can see it turn off. So I'm wondering if that's almost sounds exactly like what's happening to this guy, that at least in that one with the German, he did have exposure to the
so he's
language.
listening to it constantly. And that does make sense that your brain is absorbing that without you consciously realizing that you have all of this knowledge. You're just like, your brain is literally blocking you from being able to like use it. Yeah, that would be a cool one. I would take that like sudden ability to speak a foreign language. I want it so badly. Yes. I don't really care so much about the accent, but give me the whole language. I'll take it. There is this one doctor, and her name starts with a B, and she has an accent. I wish I'd wrote it down. But she's been trying to do these tests with cranial magnetism to try to activate these parts of our brain so that we can have these basically superpowers without necessarily having to have brain damage. And so she has been working on it. She's trying. She really wants to tap into it.
Can we like volunteer? What are the side effects? You're just like the dumbest, most boring person. Like it like reverses it. You just become a real Colin Robinson. That's the side effect.
That would take a sharp turn with the podcast if that was the case. Sharp turn.
I still think it's interesting. I don't want to become a Colin Robinson, but I would love to have like my brain scanned and look at it like when I'm doing things and see how it activates and stuff. Like I think that's really interesting, and I hope that someday in the future that'll be fun, like a fun Google app. Brain scan.
Like so many episodes that we could do where it's like meditation. How does meditation like cause physical changes within the body?
We'll never fucking know because we're not disciplined enough.
We won't do it.
I will. I swear. I do notice a change
I will get my one annual meditation in.
But what if you could take a pill that all of a sudden like open that little creativity gate? Oh, the possibilities are like wild, man.
So if anybody out there has a story that we didn't tell about any kind of savant syndrome, really, acquired, sudden, regular type savant, go ahead and email us.
You can send those in to SkeleTalesPodcast@gmail.com. You can also call our hotline.
Yes, and I will give you that number. But first, Alissa and I are planning a kid episode. This will be kid friendly, so kids can listen, but also children will be telling the stories. And if you have a little one or teen or somebody who has a story to share, and this can be even just stories that they've heard on the playground, something that would be fun to listen to, you can dial the number, have them dial the number 302-689-DEAD, 302-689-3323. We want to hear from your kids, y'all, because we are gathering children up to tell stories.
Really, SkeleTales sounds like a children's book and a children's like
it'll be
Skeletots.
It's really quite delightful hearing my kids tell, oh, my friend Gray, he had this one experience, and then have them share what their friend, it's so fascinating for them too. And chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you're fascinated by the strange, unusual, paranormal. Chances are your kid is too.
Oh yeah,
take it
absolutely.
Or leave it.
And they can creep you out if you start opening that door. Mila's told us a real creepy one. I was like, I'm scared to go out in our hallway at night now.
But we want to hear from them now.
Yes, please. We're also on all the socials. We're on Instagram, Facebook.
TikTokies, Instagrams.
Yes, all those places. What else, Britt? We have a merch shop.
Yes, we've got awesome stickers over there. I'll be putting up some haunted dolls as soon as I get some time to do that. That is skeletalespodcast.etsy.com over there. And you can always become a Patreon member and get before released episodes and videos and all of those fun things. And that's at SkeleTales Podcast over on Patreon too. And anything else, Alissa?
Oh, no, just this. Haunt you later.
Haunt y'all later.
Good night.